Surpassing Satoru Gojo is something the story has hinted at from way back in chapter 11. In this case, his statement from that time, especially as it pertains to Yuji, is now once again relevant. For the longest time, majority of fans of this series thought it impossible for someone like Yuji to contend with someone like Gojo, and this was a sentiment not only Yuji shared at the time, and fans also questioned the validity of the claim when it came to the other students like Yuta, Hakari, Maki and Megumi. But with a couple of the more recent chapters pertaining to the students and Yuji in particular, we've come to realize that what once seemed like a fallacy, that is surpassing Satoru Gojo, is now attainable. And this is made no more clearer than with Yuji's current matchup against Sukuna. Yuji Itadori is seen taking on an opponent that was able to get the better of his sensei. Yuji Itadori is pushing Sukuna to the point where fans tinker and toy around the fact that Yuji is probably the strongest, though the latter claim shouldn't have much weight behind it, at least not yet. There is no doubt that with his awakening, Yuji would only continue to rise toward the realm of strongest, but as I've implied earlier, he's not quite there, at least not yet. Yuji's journey so far as a Jujutsu sorcerer has been a really crazy one. About 30 plus chapters or so, he lost Sukuna. Sukuna had activated the binding vow he set from back in the detention center, enabling him take possession of Yuji's body for a minute. And Sukuna, being the supposed groomer he is, switches up to Megumi, a child with supposedly more potential. And then if you pan over 100 chapters from that point, you'd be found reading the Shibuya incident, the arc where Yuji Itadori broke down and picked himself back up. And the 100 chapters from there would leave you at the beginning of the story. Throughout Yuji's journey, there's been multiple junctions where his strength experiences a spike in its growth, but none of these spikes compared to what happened in 256. During the course of Jujutsu kaisen 256, Yuji Itadori locks in. As a reader of the manga, you will know that this is good news, but that wouldn't be the case for the opponent. The chapter is seen concluding with Yuji landing a black flash, and the narrator explains that Itadori Yuji has finally awakened. We obviously did not know what Itadori awakened to, at least at that point in time, but it would only take the succeeding chapter to give us a hint at what Itadori Yuji would now be capable of. In JJK 257, Yuji is seen casually landing black flashes, even multiple consecutively, something that's basically unheard of. Not only did he slash Nanami and his previous record, but he did so in style, basically doubling the amount from 4/5 to 8. And who knows, the number could very well continue to stack up as his fight with Sukuna continues. In 257, Yuji was more or less taking on Sukuna on his own, with minor assistances from the rest of the bunch. Prior to now, Yuji has not really had a fight on this scale. Yes, he fought Mahito, and obviously the dynamic between him and Mahito was a great one. In fact, Mahito was a special grade course and a strong one at that. But Mahito did not just compare to the sheer force and presence of Romaine Sukuna. In the calling games, characters like Yuta and Hakari were taking on fearsome opponents. In fact, Maki should also pretty much be included. After all, she took on Cost Naoya, Maki being someone who's been relative to Yuji from the start of the story. So seeing Yuji finally standing with not just her, but the other special grade level students, with Yuji's awakening, it's barely arguable that he's not one of the strongest in this series. He's probably eclipsed Maki in strength, but it might be too early to say the same would be the case for Yuta and Hakari. The one thing that is certain at this point is that Yuji is up there with the strongest. But the thing is, Yuji Itadori is not the only student that Gojo implied had a chance of surpassing him and the grade of special grade altogether as a whole. Hakari, Kinji and Yuta Okkotsu are the other two. Yuta Okkotsu for the longest time has lived in the shadows of Satoru. Ever since his introduction, and his entire character at large is built around the fact that he's the second strongest sorcerer of present day, given that rank because he's second to Satoru Gojo himself. The narrator says this, and by his actions the story itself implies this multiple times. As a result of being second to someone like Satoru, Yuta as a special grade couldn't really shine in the spotlight, because when it came to the special grades, fans were only interested in one man, that being the Jujutsu sorcerer Satoru Gojo. In as much as losing Gojo was quite the loss for the fan base, it's undeniable that his death caused his students to rise to the occasion, and this can best be seen with Yuta Okkotsu. Back in the day, Jujutsu kaisen implies that the Heian era was the peak of strength for Jujutsu because of the presence of Romaine Sukuna. and the story implied this was the same reason why the present era was equally strong. The modern day had its own calamity in Satoru Gojo. It's just that Gojo was more on the tame side. Gojo's presence, unlike Sukuna, didn't necessarily cause the sorcerers to evolve. No, it heightened the strength of curses in the series instead. But with the gang now facing up against Sukuna, they are seen being equally forced to adapt to the might of the king of curses himself. Literally none of the sorcerers who are facing Sukuna now would stand a chance if they fought Sukuna 1 month prior, and that's because of whatever training they did during that duration of time. We basically have no idea for the most part, but when it comes to Yuta Okkotsu, it's made clear that the sorcerer resorted to some kind of foul play. Yuta says with a straight face that he cheated. This was honestly brilliant dialogue on Gege's part. As we all know now, Yuta's strength has been implied to be nearing its limits for the longest time. Back in Shibuya and even multiple other times, Kenjaku implies that inasmuch as Yuta has a vast amount of cursed energy, the ability to copy cursed techniques as well as the special grade cursed spirit Rika Orimoto in his belt. With a tool set this stacked, Kenjaku still seems to think that Yuta Okkotsu is nothing special. He's just your average special grade, at least to Kenjaku. So far, Yuta hadn't really done anything to disprove this notion. In his fight with Ishigori, it becomes even more apparent. Ishigori praises Yuta's strength, but even he acknowledges the fact that Yuta's strength is waning. He's nearing his limit. Ishigori explains this popular JJK philosophy with Yuta, the one implying that strength comes with selfishness. Yuta has, to some degree at least, adopted a sense of self. Other than Gojo at least, Sukuna had been faced with Kashimo, Higuruma and Yuji, but it's only when the child prodigy stepped up that Sukuna would be pushed. Yuta also gets bonus points for his domain expansion, as we finally get to see it in use here, and it does not disappoint. Unlike with Yuta though, Hakari's case is a bit iffy, and it's not that he isn't strong, it's just his technique is too based. For starters, Hakari has been compared to Okkotsu for the longest time. At this point, majority of the fanbase have accepted that there is some measure of relativity between those two, but in as much as those two are relative, their skill sets couldn't be more different. You see, Okkotsu is one of the most versatile fighters in the verse. Not only can he copy curse techniques, he's also equipped with a special grade Shikigami in Rika, and then we've seen him use curse tools multiple times with near excellent proficiency. Hakari on the other hand is not as stacked with techniques. Hakari's primary curse technique seems to revolve around summoning parts of a train, but that in itself isn't what makes Hakari special. No, that would lie in Hakari's domain expansion and jackpot. Hakari's domain, the Ideal Death Gamble, has a non-lethal sure hit. When his domain is active, Hakari basically plays a game. In his domain, the condition for the game is explained to his opponent. In the event Hakari lands a W in the game, say he lands a jackpot, he's granted an unlimited amount of cost energy for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, making him effectively unkillable during that amount of time. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, more times than not, would prove to be insufficient when it comes to taking down a formidable opponent during that duration. And this is where Hakari becomes something else. You see, Hakari is capable of stacking up multiple jackpots at a go, but you might ask, what are the chances that he lands a jackpot subsequently? Well, after Hakari lands his first jackpot, he's granted something known as improved probability, meaning it becomes easier to land subsequent jackpots with each successive go at it. Despite how insane I make Hakari seem, unlike with Yuta, he's very similar to Yuji and Maki. He's reliant on his fists and legs, but unlike Maki, Hakari doesn't have a special grade curse tool that can negate durability, and unlike Yuji, Hakari hasn't awakened to the point where he casually dishes out black flashes with each strike, so his chances of surpassing Gojo seem to be on the slimmer side, especially when you factor in the fact that unlike how others are facing on a threat like Sukuna, Hakari has been relegated to taking on his lapdog. This isn't to diss on Uraume, but she's no Sukuna. Yes, the curse user is strong in her own right, but she doesn't just compare to the might of Sukuna. If Hakari was to ever prove Gojo right and actually up his game, then he'd most definitely have to first wipe Uraume and then pull up to face Sukuna with the others. And the same thing can be said with Yuta actually, because currently Yuta has been put out of commission and he's yet to return to the battlefield. If Okkotsu doesn't choose to join the fight sooner rather than later, then Yuji Itadori, the true MC, our GOAT for the most part, would leave him in the dust. Much like how Yuji has gotten his awakening, the other students could get theirs, though it's unlikely. In truth, it doesn't even have to be as crazy as the one Gojo had back in Hidden Inventory, as we've seen minor power-ups go a long way in JJK. Much like how Yuji awakened with the sparks of black, Hakari and Yuta in the same vein can do something similar. Obviously, those two aren't as adept at using Black Flash like Yuji is, but Yuta is a known user and Hakari seems to be one as well. After a Black Flash is attained, the user is said to touch the core of Cursed Energy. Touching this core might very well be the amp Yuta and Hakari need to take them to the next level, much like he did Yuji. But unlike with Yuji, they'd most likely awaken to a different skill set, and not one bound within the limits of the Black Flash. The very reason majority of the fanbase thought it impossible to surpass Satoru Gojo lies in his curse techniques Infinity and Limitless. His domain expansion was obviously a factor as well. You see, prior to these more recent events in the manga, the gap in strength between Gojo and the strongest students, say Yuta Okkotsu at the time, was immeasurable, to say the least. Previously, the sheer scale of Gojo's Jujutsu was something the students could barely comprehend, let alone hope to mimic, and then let alone hope to surpass. Gojo was equipped with Blue, the force of attraction, a technique that could even destroy a fused Shikigami like Agito. Gojo had his Red, his force of repulsion, the reversal of Blue, a curse technique that could damage special grades like Sukuna, scarring them, and even sometimes leaving them with less body parts than usual. The icing on this cake being Gojo's hollow purple, the combination of red and blue, creating an imaginary mass, supposedly capable of destroying any form of matter. Now, when you consider all that Gojo is equipped with, the students no longer seem to be all that impressive. Or do they? Well, with the calling games, Yuta Okkotsu acquires a whole bunch of curse techniques. You see, Gojo has raw firepower, and Yuta acquires something very similar to Red. It doesn't exactly have the properties of repulsion like Red does, but when hit with a granite blast, I'm very sure the same effect is produced. Much like how Gojo's Infinity is hacked, Okkotsu would later go on to acquire Chao's Future Sight. And much like how Purple was capable of damaging Sukuna to an insane degree, Okkotsu Yuta acquired Jacob's Ladder. And even now, he's acquired the curse technique of the very opponent who cut down his sensei. But Hakari is yet to deliver. With Hakari fans out there and the others who understand Hakari's character, Hakari doesn't seem to be one who gives up easily. He's obviously not one who would like to be surpassed by his supposed rival. With his upcoming fight against Uraume in view, it's very possible that even he'd be stepping up his game sometime soon. This video had to be put out there because for the longest time, in as much as Jujutsu Kaisen implies the students would one day surpass Satoru Gojo, the series would only go out of its way to counter that implication multiple times. And whenever we tried to comprehend the gap between Gojo and the students, we were left with a task that seemed near impossible. If the cast had continued improving in a linear fashion, then Jujutsu Kaisen would have needed well over 1,000 chapters for any of the students to be able to compare to the likes of Gojo. That's the reason why at the pace the story was moving previously, it seemed impossible for any of the students to reach the height of Satoru Gojo. But now that's not exactly the case. Gojo's statements from back in the beginning that once seemed like a naive dream doesn't seem so impossible anymore, but who knows what the future has in store for these students. I didn't want to cover Maki and Megumi all that much because those two weren't exactly there when he called upon those who could surpass him. Granted, Maki's heavenly restriction makes her one of the heavy hitters, and Megumi is equipped with one of the greatest curse techniques in the series. The chances of those two pulling it off is just considerably slimmer than the chances are with the other three. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to leave a like. If you have something to say, then you can put it in the comments. And if you want to stay up to date with the channel, then please feel free to subscribe.